September 13, 1942. A lone Soviet KV-1 heavy tank sat immobilized in a muddy field outside the small village of Nizhnemediakinskaya, deep in the Don River bend. Its tracks had been blown off by a German mine. Its radio was destroyed. It had no way to move and no way to call for help. The crew could have abandoned their crippled tank and retreated to Soviet lines 3 kilometers away. Instead, they stayed. For 18 hours, 5 men in one disabled tank would fight off an entire German Panzer Regiment, destroying dozens of vehicles and inflicting hundreds of casualties in one of the most incredible defensive stands in military history. The tank commander was Senior Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov, a 24-year-old veteran who had already survived a year of the brutal Eastern Front War. His crew consisted of 4 men: gunner Ivan Duryugin, loader Pavel Kazimyakin, driver Petr Kishkin, and radio operator Pyotr Seliverstov. They were experienced tankers who had fought together for months, developing the kind of coordination that comes only from shared combat. They would need every bit of that experience to survive what was coming. The KV-1 heavy tank was a formidable machine, one of the Soviet Union's best armored vehicles in 1942. It weighed 47 tons, mounted a powerful 76 gun, and had armor up to 110 thick on the turret front. German anti-tank guns at that stage of the war struggled to penetrate KV-1 armor at any range. The tank's main weakness was mechanical unreliability and poor visibility. But in a defensive position where it didn't need to move, these weaknesses became irrelevant. The KV-1 became essentially a fortified bunker. With a big gun, Konovalov's tank had been part of a Soviet defensive line, attempting to slow the German advance toward Stalingrad. The Soviet 1st Tank Corps was conducting a fighting withdrawal, trying to buy time for defensive positions to be prepared closer to the city. During the retreat on September 12, Konovalov's tank hit a mine that destroyed its left track. The crew worked frantically through the night trying to repair it, but the damage was too severe. By dawn on September 13, they faced a choice: abandon the tank or stay and fight from a fixed position. The decision to stay violated Soviet doctrine. Standing orders required crews of disabled tanks to destroy their vehicles and withdraw rather than allow capture. But Konovalov looked at the tactical situation and made a different calculation. His tank was positioned on high ground overlooking the only road the Germans could use to advance. If he stayed, he could block that advance, at least temporarily. If he withdrew, the Germans would move through unopened. His decision wasn't heroism for its own sake. It was a cold tactical judgment that his crew could accomplish more by fighting than by retreating. At approximately 700 hours, the first German vehicles appeared on the road below. They were reconnaissance elements of the 14th Panzer Division, advancing cautiously, screening for the main body of the regiment behind them. Konovalov watched through his commander's periscope as German motorcycle troops and armored cars moved into range. He let them approach to about 800 meters, well within the effective range of his 76 gun. Then he gave the order to fire. Duryugin, the gunner, had the first armored car centered in his sights. The 76 gun roared. The armor-piercing round struck the German vehicle dead center, penetrating easily and detonating the ammunition inside. The armored car exploded in a ball of flame. Before the Germans could react, Konovalov had identified the next target. Another round loaded, another shot, another German vehicle destroyed. Within 90 seconds, 3 German reconnaissance vehicles were burning wrecks on the road. The German reaction was immediate and predictable. They had encountered what they assumed was a Soviet defensive position, probably multiple tanks, definitely dug in and prepared. The reconnaissance elements fell back to report contact with enemy armor. The main German column halted while commanders assessed the situation and brought up heavier weapons. This was exactly what Konovalov wanted: delay, confusion, and time bought for Soviet forces withdrawing behind him. For the next hour, there was an uneasy standoff. German forces probed cautiously, trying to determine the size and composition of the Soviet position. They sent infantry forward in small groups to scout. Konovalov used his machine guns to drive them back, carefully conserving his main gun ammunition for armored targets. The Germans still didn't realize they were fighting a single, immobilized tank. They assumed they had encountered a prepared defensive line with multiple vehicles and supporting infantry around 900 hours. German artillery began falling around Konovalov's position. The first rounds were ranging shots, walking closer to the tank as German forward observers adjusted fire. Soon, high-explosive shells were landing within meters of the KV-1. The crew felt the impacts through the tank's armor, heard the shrapnel rattling against the hull, but the thick armor held. A direct hit from a 105 artillery shell might penetrate, but near misses, no matter how close, could not. The KV-1 was built to withstand this kind of punishment. The artillery barrage lasted 20 minutes, churning the ground around the tank into a moonscape of craters and torn earth. When it lifted, German tanks advanced. 3 Panzer IIIs and 2 Panzer IVs moved up the road in tactical formation, their commanders confident that the artillery had destroyed, or at least suppressed, whatever Soviet forces held the position. They were wrong. Konovalov waited until the German tanks were at 600 meters, close enough to guarantee penetration, far enough to give him time for multiple shots before they could effectively return fire. "Gunner Panzer, 600 meters lead tank," he called out calmly. Duryugin centered his crosshairs on the advancing Panzer III. The 76th gun fired. The German tank shuddered as the round punched through its frontal armor, killing the crew instantly. The tank rolled to a stop, smoke pouring from the hatches. The remaining German tanks immediately took evasive action, spreading out and looking for cover. But the road ran through open terrain with little concealment. Another Panzer III tried to reverse behind a small rise. Konovalov's second shot caught it in the side armor as it turned. The tank brewed up, ammunition cooking off in a series of internal explosions. Within 3 minutes of the engagement starting, 2 German tanks were destroyed, and the others had retreated out of effective range. German commanders now faced a serious problem. A single position, they still didn't know it was one tank, was blocking the only good road forward. The terrain on either side was marshy and difficult for armor. They could try to flank the position, but that would take time and expose them to ambush. They could call for more artillery and air support, but those assets were in short supply and needed elsewhere. The simplest solution was to bring up enough firepower to simply obliterate whatever was in that position. Over the next several hours, the Germans launched repeated attacks. Small groups of tanks would advance, try to get close enough for effective fire, and be driven back by Konovalov's accurate shooting. German infantry attempted to work around the flanks and were cut down by machine gun fire. Anti-tank guns were brought forward, but their crews were killed before they could effectively engage. The single KV-1 repulsed every attack loader. Kazimyakin worked with mechanical efficiency, pulling 76 rounds from the ammunition racks, loading them into the breech, closing it, tapping the gunner's shoulder to signal ready. In the confined space of the tank, with the gun firing repeatedly and spent shell casings piling up on the turret floor, the heat became oppressive. The crew stripped to their undershirts, sweat pouring off them, but they never stopped working. Load, fire, an endless rhythm punctuated by the roar of the gun and the impact of German fire against their armor. By noon, Konovalov's tank had destroyed at least 7 German tanks, 5 armored cars and 3 trucks. Dozens of German infantry lay dead in the fields around the position. The ammunition supply was diminishing. They had started with 111 rounds for the main gun and were down to perhaps 30. But more concerning was the increasing number of hits the tank was taking. German gunners were zeroing in on them, and the accumulated damage was beginning to tell. A Panzer IV round struck the front of the KV-1's turret at 12:30 hours. The armor held, but the impact was tremendous. Inside the tank, the crew was thrown against their stations. Severstov, the radio operator, suffered a concussion from his head striking metal. Blood streamed down his face, but he stayed at his post, manning the bow machine gun when Germans came close. The tank's optics were damaged, making it harder to identify and engage targets precisely. But the main gun still worked. The armor still held. They could still fight. The Germans brought up their heaviest weapons. An 88 anti-aircraft gun, the dreaded H-stitch that could penetrate any Soviet tank at any range, was manhandled into position. The gun crew knew they were exposed and vulnerable, but counted on 1 or 2 quick shots to finish the Soviet tank before it could respond. They didn't get the chance. Konovalov spotted the gun being set up at 900 meters. Before it could fire, Deryugin put a 76 round directly into the gun shield, killing the entire crew. The destruction of the 88 gun seemed to break something in the German attack. For nearly 6 hours, one Soviet tank had held them up, destroyed their vehicles, killed their men, and defied every attempt to eliminate it. German regimental commander Oberst Friedrich Schultz was facing a situation that bordered on the absurd. An entire Panzer Regiment, over 100 tanks and supporting vehicles, was being stymied by what intelligence now suggested was a single enemy tank. His division commander was demanding to know why the advance had stalled. Schultz had no good answer. Around 1400 hours, the Germans tried a different approach. They brought up smoke generators and laid a thick smoke screen across the battlefield, obscuring the Soviet tank's vision. Under cover of the smoke, German combat engineers attempted to work close enough to place demolition charges directly on the KV-1. It was a desperate tactic, essentially a suicide mission, but German frustration had reached the point where they were willing to try anything. The engineers never reached the tank. Konovalov, hearing movement in the smoke, ordered the bow machine gun to fire blindly into the white murk. The 7.62 rounds found targets. Screams echoed through the smoke. The engineers fell back, dragging their wounded, the mission abandoned. The KV-1 sat silent and menacing in its craterpock position, seemingly invincible, certainly undefeated. As the afternoon wore on, the character of the battle changed. The Germans stopped trying to destroy the tank directly and instead focused on bypassing it. Reconnaissance elements found routes through the marsh on either side of the road. They were difficult and slow, but they were passable. The main German column began moving around Konovalov's position, leaving him isolated but unable to interfere significantly with their advance. Konovalov understood what was happening. His mission, delay the German advance, had been accomplished. He had bought 18 hours for Soviet forces to retreat and establish new defensive positions. The cost in German casualties and destroyed equipment had been extraordinary. But now he faced a new decision: continue fighting from an increasingly irrelevant position, or attempt to save his crew by surrendering or withdrawing. The crew discussed their options briefly. They were running low on ammunition. Fewer than 20 main gun rounds remained. The tank had taken dozens of hits. Several vision blocks were smashed. Some external equipment was damaged, but miraculously, nothing critical had been penetrated. They were exhausted, hungry, thirsty, and wounded. Severstov was barely conscious. Kishkin had shrapnel wounds in his arm. But they could still fight. Around 1800 hours. With dusk approaching, Konovalov made his decision. They would wait until dark, then attempt to withdraw. The tank couldn't move on its own, but Kishkin thought he could rig a field-expedient repair to the track that might allow them to limp back to Soviet lines at reduced speed. If they could get the tank mobile again under cover of darkness, they might escape. As darkness fell, the crew began working on the damaged track. It was dangerous work. They were exposed outside the tank's armor protection, and German forces were all around them. But the Germans had stopped actively attacking the position, content to bypass it and continue their advance. In the darkness and confusion of the battlefield, 5 men working on tank repairs went unnoticed. The field repair took 3 hours. Using spare track links and improvised tools, Kishkin and Kazimyakin managed to create a functional, if fragile, track. It wouldn't survive combat maneuvering, but it might carry them the 3 kilometers back to Soviet lines. At 2100 hours, Kishkin started the engine. The V2 diesel roared to life, incredibly loud in the night silence. German forces certainly heard it, but in the darkness, they couldn't see where it was coming from or what it meant. Konovalov ordered the tank to move. Slowly, painfully, the KV-1 backed away from its position and turned east towards Soviet lines. The repaired track held, creaking and threatening to break with every meter, but holding. They moved without lights, navigating by compass and instinct, expecting at any moment to run into German positions or have the track fail completely. Neither happened. At 23:45 hours, September 13, 1942, Konovalov's battered KV-1 rolled into Soviet lines. The crew was immediately surrounded by astonished Soviet soldiers who had written them off as dead hours earlier. The tank's armor was scarred with dozens of impact marks, testament to the punishment it had endured. But it was still intact, still functional, still deadly. Against all odds, they had survived. The immediate tactical report went up the Soviet chain of command. 1 KV-1 tank, crew of 5, had engaged German forces for 18 hours, destroyed at least 13 German tanks, over 10 other vehicles, and killed or wounded an estimated 200 German soldiers. The German advance had been delayed nearly a full day. The crew had suffered minor wounds but no fatalities. The tank required significant maintenance but was repairable. Senior officers found the report difficult to believe. One tank couldn't have achieved these results. There must have been other forces involved that weren't reported. But interrogation of the crew and confirmation from other Soviet units in the area verified the story. It had been just 5 men in 1 immobilized tank. German prisoners captured days later confirmed it from their side. An entire Panzer Regiment had been held up for most of a day by a single Soviet heavy tank they couldn't destroy. Konovalov and his crew were awarded the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Soviet Union's highest military decorations. Their story was featured in Soviet military newspapers as an example of courage, skill, and the superiority of Soviet equipment. The propaganda value was enormous. It proved that Soviet tanks and tankers could defeat German panzers even when outnumbered and in desperate situations. But the military lessons were even more valuable than the propaganda. Soviet tank doctrine was modified based on the engagement. The effectiveness of heavy tanks in static defensive positions was demonstrated. The importance of armor and gun power over mobility in certain situations was validated. Training emphasized the kind of crew coordination that Konovalov's team had displayed, where each man knew his job perfectly and worked seamlessly with the others. For the Germans, the engagement was embarrassing and concerning. Post-battle analysis revealed serious deficiencies. German anti-tank weapons in 1942 were insufficient against heavy Soviet armor. German tactics for reducing fortified positions were inadequate when facing well-handled tanks. German intelligence had underestimated Soviet tank crew quality and determination. These lessons would influence German tank development, leading to bigger guns and heavier armor, and tactical doctrine for the remainder of the war. Semyon Konovalov survived the war, continuing to command tanks through numerous battles. He fought at Stalingrad, Kursk, and in the final push into Germany. He ended the war as a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest award the nation could bestow. But he always said his most important battle was September 13, 1942, when he and 4 other men in 1 broken tank stood alone against an entire German regiment and refused to yield. The other crew members had varied fates. Gunner Ivan Deryugin was killed at Kursk in July 1943, his tank destroyed by a German Tiger. Loader Pavel Kazimyakin survived the war but died in 1956 from complications related to wounds received in 1944. Driver Petr Kishkin lived until 1982, working as a factory mechanic and telling the story of September 13 to anyone who would listen. Radio operator Pyotr Seliverstov, who fought through his concussion that day, died in 1945 when his tank was knocked out just outside Berlin. The KV-1 tank itself was repaired and returned to service. It fought in several more engagements before being knocked out permanently in December 1942. Soviet recovery crews couldn't retrieve it from the battlefield, and it was captured by Germans who studied it extensively, trying to understand how it had survived so much punishment. After the war, the tank was never found, presumably scrapped by retreating Germans or destroyed beyond recognition. No physical memorial to that incredible stand exists except in photographs and records. The story of how a single Soviet tank held off an entire Panzer regiment became legendary in Soviet military history, told and retold in schools, films, and books. It represented something essential about the Eastern Front War, that determination, skill, and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. 5 men in one disabled tank, outnumbered hundreds to one, outgunned by an entire regiment, had stood their ground and triumphed. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were supremely skilled, because their equipment was excellent, and because they refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. That refusal, multiplied across millions of Soviet soldiers throughout the war, ultimately won the victory that destroyed Nazi Germany.